Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where weekly we sit down with amazing people, authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders who walk us through their journey and share the secrets of their success. Today's guest, Gretchen Anderson. Gretchen is director at the Katzenbach Center, working with client teams across the globe, and is co-author of the brand new book, The Critical Few: Energize Your Company's Culture by Choosing What Really Matters. In Critical Few, Gretchen identifies 4 critical elements in a company's culture that can catalyze true evolution: traits, keystone behaviors, authentic informal leaders, and metrics that encourage a self-reinforcing cycle of lasting change. By identifying and focusing on these, leaders can set a clear direction, inspire their people, and evolve their work cultures. Gretchen, it's so great to have you with us on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm so well. Thank you, Jake.
So excited to jump into this book. I've got a copy of it sitting right here on my desk. It's a beautiful book. But before we do that, I missed a whole bunch by way of intro. Tell us, who is Gretchen Anderson?
I am a former poetry scholar who got into strategy consulting after finishing a doctorate in English literature at about 30. I went into consulting sort of interested in the question. I had written my graduate thesis about poets in Greenwich Village during the 20s. I found that I was really compelled by the question of how do individuals interact with the ecosystems around them. Mm-hmm. And I found my way into consulting and actually found a place in that field to ask that question in different ways. And that has been the question that's kind of propelled me through my career. What is the relationship between an individual person doing their work, however that work is defined, and the ecosystem of people around them?
That's such a fascinating background. And, you kind of went on this journey of learning to write and really getting good at it. And then you got into consulting. Tell me a little bit about this consulting. Who was hiring you and kind of what were you consulting on?
Yeah, well, I started actually at a firm. There's a lot of serendipity in my story. I landed in a firm. I was living in New York. It was about 2002 or 2003. And through a friend of a friend, I landed in John Katzenbach's firm he founded after leaving McKinsey. That firm was called Katzenbach Partners. At the time, it was about 65 people. And I was there for 5 years. We were doing work that was at the intersection of strategy and organizations. So a very special kind of firm doing work that related to that question of, what motivates people to do their best work.
And so you were with that consulting agency for a little while. And then where are you now? Tell us a little bit about this Katzenbach Center that you're working for and what you do.
So the Katzenbach Center is sort of vestigial of that original firm. In that firm, we did a lot of work for other professional services firms, sort of offering them advice. Ended up being acquired by Booz & Company after it spun off from Booz Allen Hamilton. And then that firm the Booz & Company was acquired about 3.5 years ago into PricewaterhouseCoopers and became Strategy And now the Katzenbach Center is a center of excellence and knowledge within PwC that we develop thought leadership. We work with people on the topic of culture and leadership.
Wow, this is a terrific guest for our show. And I know the listeners have got their ears perked up because what you're talking about is so vitally important right now. This idea of company culture. And as one of our recent guests, we were just talking about the diversity in the workforce and how that's such a great thing for companies, right? Because it's allowing us to kind of see outside the box and to solve problems that our clients and customers are having that maybe we don't see or recognize. But it's also creating tension within the workforce, particularly as we blend different cultures. I had lived in Silicon Valley for 6 years just recently, and it's really a melting pot. You're from New York City, having spent some time there. Tell us a little bit about the value of company culture and what we're seeing today.
I think what we're coming to understand about, I think organizational culture has always existed, right? Like whenever people get into a space together and try to accomplish something in tandem, like a set of self-reinforcing behaviors are developing between them, and they develop a cultural identity as a group. When you broaden that out into an organization and how it works together, you have ecosystems and subcultures and just a net of human relationships. I think what's happening is, I think the life cycle of companies is shorter than it used to be. I think the market is changing so fast. You have huge things happening outside in the world that puts pressure on those, organisms, for want of a better word. And then you also have people bringing their whole selves to work in new ways. You have an increasing diversity of thought and opinions, sort of identities. So that same pressure from the outside is just making that question of how does this culture support what we're trying to do? I think the question has just become thornier and more complicated, and also I might say more interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. As we look at kind of the evolution of the workforce, location-wise, I know that my team, we have 35 people on our team, and nobody else is in Phoenix but me. In fact, nobody else is in Arizona but me on a team of 35. So technology has allowed us geographically to expand, but also technology has allowed us to connect like you and I, connecting over the podcast.
Totally. And the same water that floats the boat overturns it, right? Like we have this ability, we have this new pressure on work, we have all these demands, and we have this ability to form more and more human relationships that are work relationships, and we're not making eye contact with each other. We're not seeing someone's face in the morning and knowing if they had a bad night's sleep because their kid was up. We're operating with less clues, but still needing these sort of human interactions to make our work experiences effective and meaningful. So yeah, it's really, you bring up an excellent point around technology, and we've thought a lot about this.
Yeah, and one of the guests that we recently had was talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and saying that they missed one. In fact, the very first one, and that is the need to belong. Like even before survival and shelter and that, this need to be a part of something. And now because of this ability of us to work from home offices, to be separated, we don't have that water cooler talk.
I've definitely taken that from 15 years of working with John Katzenbach. I think what he thinks about and writes about broadly is this idea that we have a deep human longing to feel aligned with something bigger than ourselves. And that for the leadership or the organization that doesn't see the ways that they can step in there and try to line up my feeling of wanting to feel like what I'm doing and delivering contributes to a larger whole, sort of woe be to that leader, right? And I think you bring up a great sense, like how do we develop that feeling of belonging when we can feel so isolated even while connected?
Yeah, and while we talk more often than ever before, like I'm on the phone, I'm interacting with humans 12 hours a day. I mean, there's usually not a minute of the day that I'm not flapping my lips and talking here, but it's a different level of connection when you're not being able to see the nonverbal cues, not being able to see the sagging of the shoulders or the drooping of the eyelids or whatever it may be in the interaction, when you're just communicating audibly and not visually.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So one of these things that's very fascinating to me is this recent PwC survey. 80% of respondents said their organization's culture must evolve in the next 5 years for their company to succeed, grow, and retain the best people. So you got a vast majority of respondents that are saying, look, our company's culture needs to change.
We're fascinated with that number, right? That was there were 2,000 respondents to that survey, and they stretched from the Middle East to Japan to North America, and they were at all levels. Like the unanimity of 80% of people agreeing to anything, let alone something as, not intuitive as that. I thank you for pulling that data point out, and I agree. I think it's a fascinating one.
The flip side of that then is 23% of business leaders said they've tried to change their culture, but couldn't. So tell me about this, because I believe that this kind of study and survey really led to, it either led to you writing and co-writing this critical few, or it was obviously part of this. So tell me about this study and then how it led to the book.
So the study, I would describe the things as parallel. Like first of all, we've been working on studies like these kind of longitudinally for repeated years. We did that same study. We asked an almost identical survey 4 years ago, and you'll love this, Jake. This is fascinating. At that point, I think the data point was 54% agreed that culture needed to evolve. And that was one of the biggest leaps we saw over the 4-year span. Isn't that interesting?
It's a huge leap in 4 years.
That's a huge leap. And does that mean that people are talking about culture more as a business issue? Does that mean questions of culture are getting trickier and thornier? Does that mean organizations are being pressed to evolve faster and therefore know the culture needs to catch up? Who knows? Probably all of the above, right?
I would say yes.
Totally. So like a really big leap that we saw there. We've been doing those kinds of studies, and that's really the advantage to us in being part of something as sort of massive and behemoth as PwC, right? Like we're part of we're a little center within a firm of, I think, 350 or 400,000 globally.
Massive reach.
Massive reach. Yeah. And that idea that we are within this giant firm, really to be able to get out there and get those kinds of data points and perspective, it allows us to see kind of like universal human truths about how organizations feel about culture, right? Like this is not narrowly restricted to how leaders think in North America, right? Which I think is like part of what's really cool.
It's really cool, and it's really important because the world's flatter now. I mean, because of technology. I just got off the phone literally 15 minutes before I called you with a gentleman out of Stockholm, Sweden, and we were speaking as if we were next door neighbors. I mean, it's amazing, and that's why it's so important that this is a global study, not just a North America study.
I'll make that case till I run out of breath, that we really do need to look at questions about culture and organizations at that kind of a level because of the way the world is moving. Totally with you. But so the book was written like alongside John Katzenbach and I started talking about this book, thinking about writing this book, talking about this book, pointing our finger at studies we'd done in the market and how they might relate to the book. We started talking about that, Jake, guess how many years ago?
Well, let's see, 2003, the beginning.
No, not that
long ago. How long?
7 years ago, actually. I came to run this. He and I started running this center together. I came to work with him right after the birth of my first child. So I know specifically, we started having those conversations.
Yeah.
And then, the shifts in, our acquisition into PwC, a lot of things changed. But we also got this much broader set of colleagues and aficionados and champions to work with and play with. So the book was very much, it evolved through us saying, hey, this is working here. Let's kind of honeybee this idea over to a team in South Africa. Let's take what we're learning and tell all of our colleagues in pharma. It was very much evolved out of a collective, let's take these ideas and try them out and see what we learn and sort of bring that back and write about it and say, was this true? So if any book could be said to have many authors in terms of what the method is, this is a book that has many, many authors and many contributors. And we put some of the primary ones, we put their bios into the back of the book, and that was really important to us and sort of listed them within. But there were a lot of people who touched and contributed to this content.
Well, let's jump into a little bit of it, and it's a great book, so the listeners need to go pick up a copy to really get the feel for it. But let's talk about a few topics from the book. Particularly, let's talk about these critical few behaviors that energize companies' culture.
So the idea of the book is that, first of all, we start with this notion that the way to evolve culture is to start with behaviors, not that culture isn't a big and baggy and hairy thing that includes mindsets and beliefs and values. All of those things are implicit and part of a culture, but we focus on this notion that if you want to see this hairy beast evolve, what you need to do is start with behaviors, because behaviors are observable and repeatable and tangible. I can say to you, Jake, I witnessed how you behaved. I cannot say, I know what you think.
Right.
Therefore, I can influence and potentially evolve or move your behaviors in a way that your mind is your mind and completely out of my domain. So we take this very behaviors focused approach. Then what we argue is that to say, of course, if you want anything to change, there are millions of ways that people could act differently to move in a direction. We've all had that experience of like, in the human experience of living in a body, we've thought about how to be healthier or change some kind of habit. And something we all know experientially is that to try to change everything is the same as trying to change nothing at all, right? Like you need to pick a couple of habits and stick with them. I travel with my yoga mat. It is a trigger behavior. That means I wake up in a hotel room and spend 20 minutes and know I'll have a better day. But the notion of a critical few behaviors is that, can we make that happen? Can you have the discipline and the focus and the coherence to make that selection of a couple of behaviors and organization-wide focus on that happen across an entity? And in doing that, can you accelerate and amplify and make measurable this difficult and important act of evolving a culture to better align with your strategic intent?
Let's break this down a little bit. I want to go a little bit deeper and say, okay, I see what you're saying with the yoga mat. Now let's take it to our company, our business, that we're trying to create this action, this outcome. Let's talk about an example of maybe a behavior that we could adjust or work on, a keystone behavior to do that.
Yeah, let me give you an example. I was working with a leadership team recently, and they were talking about overall in their organization, too much churn. And we hear this a lot, too many internal meetings, not enough external focus. The larger organizations grow and the more complicated, the more time it just takes to navigate, consolidate, get consensus within, and people start to feel stuck and static.
I think you're listening to my exact experience. I say this every single day. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, but that's that's a common complaint. And that's a cultural tendency that you can see how it becomes self-reinforcing, right? So what is a behavior? So we spent a time in that leadership meeting talking about could we imagine, and we had them brainstorm and then select down, and they decided and committed to each other within that room at a leadership team level, they were going to never send a calendar invitation without specifying what are the decisions that will be made in this meeting. And that's huge.
It's massive.
Think about it. Think about if you looked at your calendar for tomorrow and if every meeting on it had, I was so excited about this meeting because we've got an outcome, like at the end of this, there's a podcast, and what pleasure in knowing the outcome, but how unusual is that in your day? So that's kind of an example of it's tangible, it's practical, it's observable. I can look at your calendar tomorrow, Jake, and I could be like, you've got all these meetings on it. Did you send those invitations and specify outcomes? So it's kind of, they usually almost sound sort of domestic and small, but in being so, they're grounded in the way that people do real work.
I think this is very important, this intentionality, but I wanted to ask you, how do we do it if we're not the leader, if we're not calling the meeting, if we're just being invited to meetings? I've got a calendar full of meetings today.
Yeah.
Some of them I'm in charge of, and some of them I'm just a guest. I'm invited to.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would encourage, it is what it is. I think we're all leaders at all levels, right? I think, and I think we all have an individual responsibility to think about what is the culture I'm in, and how do I think about within the culture that I'm part of, how can I resist a tendency? How can I see what is it that people tend to do that supports how work gets done, the best kind of work gets done, and how can I individually do more of it and signal to others, I'm doing more of this in a purposeful way because I think our culture should move in this direction. And conversely, how can I say this is a kind of cultural tendency you can be a voice for? The ways that we behave every day are all that this culture is. This culture is not this magical thing outside of us that we're all powerless to control. The culture is the sum total of all of our behaviors, and it can start with me. I think that's what you can do as an individual. You can think about culture in a grounded, practical, can resist the ever tempting tendency to throw your hands in the air and say, I can't change anything. The culture is too embedded. The culture is too stuck. It is easy to do that. And it is harder and more important and more productive to say, this is the culture we have. Here's where my foot is getting purchase. And look, watch me do this and let's do this too.
And as you were talking through that, the thought that came to my mind is different aspects of our company culture can be represented as like boats in the ocean, boats in the water. Some of them are small and they could turn really easy. Others, giant.
A flotilla of boats is what we're talking about.
A flotilla of boats. Some of them turn easy, some of them not as easy.
Yes, and they have a relationship to each other, even though they're independent entities. Totally. I love that as a metaphor.
Well, very good. So that's one of the ways that we can focus on changing some of the behaviors that is going to lead to higher productivity, higher happiness. One of the things you said that I wanted to circle back to that I think relates to this, and you said that the life cycle of business is shorter today. And I think the life cycle of employment is shorter today as well. And so talk to me a little bit about how company culture and this Keystone Behaviors plays into the life cycle of employment with our employees.
Meaning, do you mean that like from an organizational perspective, Jake? Like if we accept like, within the organization I'm in, PwC, if I accept there is, to some extent we're built on a model of people coming in and having a wonderful apprenticeship, taking those skills and moving on. If I accept that organization-wide, how do I think about culture and behaviors with that being true? Is that what you're asking?
I would think that most of the listeners to this podcast would love to have the same kind of process-driven, employment mentoring that PwC has. But most of our listeners are very small businesses. They're 10, 15 employees, maybe $1 million, $2 million in revenue annually. And so they don't have the kind of structure. But more what I'm referring to is these studies that have shown that the length of time that an employee sticks with a company is basically in half of what it was, let's say, even 5 years ago. And so people are afraid to bring somebody on their team if they say this person's only going to be with me for 1 year. And I think that's a cultural thing within our company.
I think like any kind of cultural set of tendencies that we're talking about, some of it I think is acceptance and work with rather than resist and try to bemoan.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. It is what it is. We need to accept it and work within what we are dealt, kind of, if you say the cards that were dealt, as opposed to standing back and bemoaning the fact that this is the way it was and we wish we could change it.
There is no universal metric of what is a culture that is aligned, right? Like we don't talk about good or bad cultures. We talk about cultures that have tendencies that line up with what your strategy is, right? Nevertheless, I do think, if I said to you, PwC's retention of recent college graduates is better than our peers, you and I would kind of agree that aligns with our culture, right? Like keeping people, and let me be clear, I don't know that data point.
We're using this as examples.
Using it as an example, yeah, I would like to believe that about my firm, which I have, I think does great things for people, but I'm not quoting that and saying that that's a true stat. I should find that out actually, but that's not a stat I'm throwing out there, but I do think, given a situation where you're hiring someone and you're looking at them and thinking, I know they might move on in a year. I think thinking about what is it that's going to make them use we rather than I when they talk about this place. And even though they might move on, if I could keep them 3 months longer, isn't that productive? Can I make them feel like this is going to be an experience for them being part of something? Because there's also, I think there is no organization that doesn't need people to move on from it and continue to have a positive feeling of affiliation and identity with having been part of that place. I don't think we ever give up our status as having been part of something. We just become sort of ambassadors for it out in the world.
Yeah, and ambassadors either positively or negatively. I love what you said about how can we change the mindset or help the mindset evolve to the point where they talk in terms of we as opposed to I? That really triggered a light bulb for me. It's a great kind of idea. And then you followed that up by saying, if we could get 3 months out of somebody who was going to leave 3 months sooner, isn't that an advantage or a benefit to us? And I think you're absolutely right. If we hire good people, we want them to stay. If we can get an extra week or 2 weeks or a month or 2 months or 5 months out of a good person, that's a win for us.
Yep. And the extra 2 months and their, continued, we all need to think more organizationally and individually about our external networks as much as our internal networks, right? So to think about this person, I am hiring you, Jake, and we are going to have a certain kind of affiliation to the culture of this company while you're here, and then we're going to continue to have a kind of relationship. I would say when I think about the broader network of the Katzenbach Center, it includes many, many people who have moved on and continue to share thoughts back with us. And I think that model is I think that's all organizations should be thinking like that. I'm not saying all organizations should be like the Katzenbach Center. I'm just kidding. But I think that, that notion that our career paths intersect and then continue to be part of ecosystems together.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about on this podcast a lot is this universal choreography. I believe that the universe has this dance, this choreography where they swing people into our lives, into our companies, into our businesses at the times that they're needed. And then oftentimes they swing out to go do something else and a new dance partner is swung in. And this universal choreography really helps us achieve higher levels. Now, Gretchen, I wanted to ask you, what's the difference between critical traits and critical behaviors?
Great question. The traits are, remember when I was saying, let's be grounded in this notion of, let's accept that someone's going to move, you're coming from a subculture of people who are going to move on within a year. Could you stay a year and a half? When I was talking about that, I was saying, let's accept what the traits are. We try to do that organization wide. So we say, in order to understand what behaviors we want to help you focus on and change, we have to have a sense of where we're starting from. What are the intersecting set of cultural tendencies? And we like to talk about them in neutral terms. For example, a trait of your organization might be consensus driven. That is a trait that has some manifestations that are positive, decisions that get made are fully vetted. People don't feel like mandates are coming down from on high. There's buy-in. Consensus-driven can also slow things down. It can thin out exciting solutions into more weak tea, right? So we spend time working with an organization to help them understand these are what the traits are. This is where we're starting from.
All right. And then that proceeds into like the actions, right? This is the behaviors that reinforce the traits.
Right. And a really important point is like if we accept the paradox at the heart of culture evolution, as we talk about it, is that culture change is difficult and requires a lot of caloric energy and takes a long time. And it's also possible and needs to start with deliberate, purposeful actions right away. Right. So let's say we agree that these traits are your traits, and we agree there's some really important reason you need greater customer centricity. You're preparing for an integration with another company. You're thinking about retention. There's something that says, okay, given what these traits are, we really do need to evolve.
Yeah.
The traits, I get that the traits aren't going to change, but I'd like the positive manifestations to be more apparent than the negative manifestation. I'd like to sort of move within it. Let's think about those behaviors as a bridge from these traits toward where we're trying to get to. So the traits notion is absolutely crucial to the behaviors notion, right? Because otherwise you're building a bridge. You need to know where you're starting from, and you need to choose behaviors that are grounded in the best ways that we work today, because that is grounded and the opposite of pie in the sky. It's like that's where you're going to get purchase.
It's got a basis in reality.
Exactly. So that's how the notion are. So then the third thing we talk about is the critical few people. So the critical few people are, in order to do this, in order to make these selections, in order to determine the traits, in order to think about what the behaviors are, best resource you have is people within your organization who already have their thumb on the pulse of what makes that organization throb and vibrate and where its life is. It's easier to find pockets of energy within your organization than it is to try to sort of impose it from the outside. So the notion of the critical few people is all along the way through this kind of approach as we describe it, your best resource are the people who are already behaving the way you need more people to behave, the people who really understand and intuit, the people who have a high influence on others, like high social capital, as we talk about it. So that's the notion that the critical few traits, that's the notion of the critical few people. We call them authentic informal leaders, the sort of special people within your organization who can help you do it right and who can help make it stick.
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation. I'm going to direct our listeners to go grab a copy of the book to really dive into how the traits and the behaviors, the key people, really interplay together, because this is where you spend a lot of time in the book. But alas, for this podcast, we're running a little bit short on time, and it's time to jump to my favorite section, which is called Learning from Leaders. Are you ready?
I was born ready, Jake.
Born ready. Well, wonderful. First question then, is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table? What are you reading?
I keep diving into this book called Everybody Lies. And it's by a guy named Stevenson Davidoff. It was written, I think, last year. A colleague, Kate, introduced me to it. And I just keep diving in. It is a book that argues that the snail trail of how we use data, essentially Google search terms, tell us more about how people think and are motivated and behave than has ever previously been possible through direct studies. And I'm really fast. I feel as if we live on the brink of a new era where data about how people interact and work together that is indirect and therefore sort of more honest and authentic is newly available to us, and in the future is going to be even more available to us. This book, Everybody Lies, is not in my field, but I think about it in relationship to my work almost more than anything else I've read in the past few years.
It's really fascinating, this idea that because computers and because technology has evolved so much, that oftentimes the algorithms know things before we do. For example, you've heard the story about the grocery store knowing that you're pregnant before you do, based on your habits and the data points that are coming in. And it's scary to a degree, but it's also very fascinating because we really can understand ourselves better at a deeper level.
Yes. And the idea of just what we know about ourselves, that's what the title Everybody Lies means. The data point that he uses that I love is a much more accurate, if you asked people directly, am I going to vote in the election? Mm-hmm. They would give an answer, yes or no. A much more accurate predictor would be, did I Google search my polling location? That's what we mean by indirect data.
Yeah.
If I Google search my polling location the night before, that correlates much better to, did I actually show up and vote, than asking me if I'm going to vote, right? We all have the best of intentions, but there's ways of tracking what our actual actions would be that are more accurate. I think that has a lot of relevance in this world of talking about culture. How do we keep it not grounded in the best of intentions, but in how people actually work together? I'm not yet sure what that link is yet, but something about this book has suggested to me a future direction that I find myself thinking about it a lot.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm going to put that on the bookshelf because that sounds like a great read. Our next question is your leadership superpower.
I think I'm good at helping other people feel excited about getting kind of nerdy with me.
So tell us about that a little bit.
I think I am good at cultivating in other people a sense that work can be fun.
Which is so vitally important because a lot of us spend a majority of our waking time at the office or working. And so what is it that motivates people to enjoy? And when we talk about the life cycle employment being shrunken in the last number of years, one of the ways that we can lengthen the time that people want to spend with our company in our business is by helping them to see the enthusiasm, the inspiration, the excitement in what they're doing. So I think that's just a wonderful superpower.
Yep, carrot, not stick.
How about a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by?
I really love the tagline of the organization StoryCorps, listening is an act of love.
I love it. And our final question then today, Gretchen, the book most often gifted, the book that you give to friends, family, or colleagues.
I really love a book that is called Dealing with Conflict. It's an HBR publication written by a woman named Amy Gallo. I feel like this notion, the subtitles of the book are assess the situation, assess it, manage it, move on. It is practical and action oriented. I think this notion, I dwell in the world of the emotional side of work, and I'm sort of thinking about it on an organizational level, on a practical, human, day-to-day way. When people are talking about conflict at work, I think if you want a practical guide to sit and read, turn to Amy Gallo. I can't think of anyone who says it better.
Well, very nice. And we need to go out and study this stuff because as we've talked for the last 30 minutes, Gretchen, this is not going anywhere. Culture is going to be important, and it's changing in how we approach it. It's changing in, some of the behaviors and the traits that we're putting towards the culture of our company, but it's not going anywhere. And if we want to be happy in our companies, we need to embrace this and really figure out what is going to be the best thing for our leadership team. Before we let you go, how can we find out more about you and pick up a copy of this book?
Yeah, pick up a copy of this book. We have an external site about the book on the PwC website. You can follow me at Twitter at gbrooks. I'm at gbrooks_anderson. And reach out to me through the Katzenbach Center. I'm always happy to continue these conversations and chat.
Well, very nice. And we're going to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book. Everything that we talked about will be on the show notes for this episode, so they could just go there, click on that, connect with Gretchen either in Twitter or over through the Katzenbach Center's website. And thank you, Gretchen, for coming on the show today and being this week's Modern Leadership guest expert.
Jake, what a pleasure. Anytime.
All right, my friends, what a fascinating conversation with Gretchen about how we can create this enthusiasm, this excitement, this culture within our offices, within our businesses to really get our team to engage and move in the right direction. I love the idea of this book, The Critical Few, the behaviors, the traits, the key individuals that really make a difference in what we're trying to accomplish, in the goal of our company. Of course, everything that we talked about in this episode of the podcast can be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML122, episode 122. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life, and remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.